The marble floors of the Palazzo Medici gleamed under the flickering candlelight as Niccolò Machiavelli adjusted his worn velvet doublet and approached the ornate desk where Lorenzo de' Medici the Younger sat counting gold florins. The year was 1513, and Florence buzzed with the energy of commerce, banking, and ruthless ambition. Outside the palazzo walls, merchants haggled over silk and spices while beggars lined the streets, a stark reminder of the brutal divide between prosperity and destitution. "You summoned me, your magnificence?" Machiavelli inquired, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics. Lorenzo looked up from his ledgers, his eyes sharp with the calculating intelligence that had made the Medici family the most powerful banking dynasty in Europe. "Niccolò, my friend, I have been contemplating your treatise on princely power. But, tonight, I wish to discuss something more immediate, more visceral than the abstract notions of statecraft. I want to understand the mechanics of wealth itself, not just how to govern those who possess it, but how to acquire it with such ferocity that poverty becomes an impossibility." Machiavelli settled into the chair across from Lorenzo, his mind already turning over the implications of this request. Throughout his career as a diplomat and political theorist, he had observed countless men rise from nothing to command vast fortunes, while others, born into privilege, squandered their inheritance through weakness and indecision. The patterns were unmistakable, the strategies repeatable, but few possessed the stomach to acknowledge them openly. The pursuit of wealth, Machiavelli began slowly, is not unlike the conquest of territories. It requires strategy, ruthlessness, and an understanding that those who hesitate, who allow sentiment to cloud their judgment, will inevitably find themselves crushed beneath the wheels of those more determined. Lorenzo nodded, leaning forward with interest. "Precisely. But, what are the specific principles? What rules govern this savage accumulation?" Over the following hours, as the candles burned lower and the sounds of Florence's nightlife faded into silence, Machiavelli outlined 10 fundamental rules that would determine whether a man lived in abundance or died in poverty. These were not mere suggestions or philosophical musings, but practical commandments forged in the crucible of Renaissance commerce and tested by generations of successful merchants, bankers, and traders. The first rule emerged from their discussion like a blade drawn from its sheath: information is the ultimate currency, and those who possess it first will always triumph over those who receive it second. Lorenzo's own family had built their empire not merely on the gold they lent, but on the intelligence networks that stretched from London to Constantinople. They knew which ships had sailed, which harvests had failed, which princes were secretly negotiating alliances before their own advisors were informed. "Consider the merchant who learns of a plague in Alexandria before his competitors," Machiavelli illustrated. He can corner the market on alternative spice routes while others are still unaware that their usual suppliers face catastrophe. The difference between this knowledge and ignorance is the difference between fortune and ruin. Lorenzo traced patterns on the desk with his finger, remembering countless transactions where advance intelligence had meant the difference between profit and loss. "And how does one acquire such information?" "Through networks of obligation," Machiavelli replied without hesitation. "You must cultivate relationships with ship captains, customs officials, merchant guilds, and court functionaries. But, more importantly, you must make yourself indispensable to them. Information flows to those who provide value in return, whether that value is coin, protection, or opportunities for advancement." The second rule crystallized as their conversation deepened: never compete on price when you can dominate through control. The most successful merchants Machiavelli had observed didn't simply offer goods more cheaply than their rivals, they controlled the supply chains that made competition impossible. "Look at how the Venetians have managed the spice trade," Lorenzo observed. "They don't merely buy and sell spices, they control the ports, the shipping routes, the relationships with Eastern suppliers. Their competitors cannot undercut them because their competitors cannot access the goods at all." Machiavelli nodded approvingly. "Exactly. The savage wealthy understand that true power lies not in efficiency but in monopoly. They seek to control resources at their source, eliminate alternative suppliers, and create dependencies that make their customers prisoners of necessity rather than choice. This led naturally to the third rule: leverage other people's money as if it were your own blood. The Renaissance had witnessed the birth of sophisticated banking and credit systems, and those who understood these mechanisms could multiply their wealth exponentially. Lorenzo's grandfather, Cosimo de' Medici, had demonstrated this principle by using depositors' funds to finance everything from international trade to papal elections, generating returns that far exceeded what his personal capital alone could have achieved. Debt, Machiavelli explained, is both weapon and tool. When you owe others, you are enslaved. When others owe you, you possess power over their destinies. But the truly savage accumulator understands a third way, using borrowed capital to generate returns while maintaining the flexibility to default if circumstances demand it. Lorenzo raised an eyebrow at this suggestion, but Machiavelli continued undeterred. I do not advocate dishonesty for its own sake, but pragmatism demands that one preserve all available options. The merchant who risks only his own capital may preserve his reputation, but he will never achieve the exponential growth that separates the wealthy from the truly rich. As the night progressed, they explored the fourth rule: create scarcity where abundance exists, and abundance where scarcity exists. This principle separated the passive wealthy from the actively savage. It required not merely responding to market conditions but actively manipulating them. The cloth merchants of Bruges have mastered this art, Machiavelli noted. When wool is plentiful, they purchase vast quantities and store them in warehouses, creating artificial scarcity that drives up prices. When wool is genuinely scarce, they flood the market with their stored inventory, undercutting competitors who cannot match their volume. But surely such practices invite retaliation from other merchants? Lorenzo questioned. They invite competition, Machiavelli corrected. But competition is the natural state of commerce. Those who fear it will never achieve dominance. The savage wealthy do not seek to avoid competition, they seek to eliminate it through superior positioning. This observation led them to the fifth rule: your reputation is a tool to be wielded, not a treasure to be preserved. Traditional merchant wisdom emphasized the importance of maintaining honor and trustworthiness in all dealings. Machiavelli had observed that the most successful operators understood reputation as a strategic asset that could be deployed selectively. A reputation for honesty, he explained, is valuable precisely because it can be spent when circumstances require deception. The merchant who is known for fair dealing can occasionally engage in sharp practices because his reputation provides cover for his actions. Conversely, the merchant who is known to be untrustworthy cannot surprise anyone with his duplicity. Lorenzo considered this carefully. You suggest that one should be honest in small matters to enable dishonesty in large ones? I suggest that one should be calculating in all matters, Machiavelli replied. Sometimes calculation demands honesty, sometimes it demands deception. The savage wealthy are not bound by abstract moral principles, they are guided by practical effectiveness. The sixth rule emerged from their discussion of reputation: allies are temporary, but obligations are permanent. In the complex world of Renaissance commerce, today's partner could become tomorrow's competitor. The savage wealthy understood that relationships should be structured to provide ongoing advantage regardless of how the partnership itself evolved. When you enter into a business relationship, Machiavelli advised, you should ensure that ending the relationship will be more costly for your partner than maintaining it. This might involve shared investments that cannot be easily divided, exclusive contracts that create dependencies, or personal knowledge that would be damaging if revealed. Such practices seem to require considerable forethought, Lorenzo observed. The savage wealthy are always thinking 3 transactions ahead, Machiavelli confirmed. They enter agreements not just for their immediate benefits, but for the strategic advantages those agreements will provide in future negotiations. As dawn approached and the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the palazzo's frescoed walls, they addressed the seventh rule: strike when your enemies are weak, not when they are strong. This principle applied as much to commercial warfare as to military campaigns. The Pazzi conspiracy against your family demonstrated the folly of attacking when your opponents are at their strongest, Machiavelli reminded Lorenzo. They moved against the Medici at the height of your power, when you had maximum resources to respond. A more calculated approach would have waited for a moment of financial vulnerability or political isolation. Lorenzo winced slightly at the mention of the conspiracy that had claimed his brother's life, but nodded in recognition of the strategic lesson. And how does one recognize such moments of weakness in commercial rivals? Through constant observation and preparation, Machiavelli answered. You must monitor your competitors' cash flows, their debt obligations, their key relationships. When a rival overextends himself to secure a major contract, when he borrows heavily to finance expansion, when he depends too heavily on a single supplier or customer, these are moments of vulnerability that the savage wealthy learn to exploit. The eighth rule naturally followed: information travels through networks of trust, but trust is always conditional. The same relationships that provided valuable intelligence could also be sources of dangerous exposure. The savage wealthy understood that they must manage information flows as carefully as they managed cash flows. Every person who knows your business represents both an opportunity and a threat, Machiavelli explained. You must provide them with enough information to make them useful, but never enough to make them dangerous. And you must always maintain alternative sources and alternate plans in case their loyalty wavers. This seems to suggest a life of constant suspicion and calculation, Lorenzo observed. It suggests a life of constant awareness, Machiavelli corrected. The savage wealthy do not live in fear, they live in preparation. They understand that loyalty, like any other commodity, has a market price, and that price is always subject to change. As the palazzo began to stir with the activities of servants preparing for the day, they discussed the ninth rule: never retreat from a position of strength. In both politics and commerce, Machiavelli had observed that those who voluntarily surrendered advantages rarely regained them. When you possess leverage over a competitor or partner, he explained, you must use that leverage to secure permanent advantages. The moment you release pressure is the moment your opponent begins to plan your downfall. The savage wealthy understand that mercy is a luxury they cannot afford. But surely some accommodation is necessary for long-term relationships? Lorenzo questioned. Accommodation, yes. Weakness, never, Machiavelli clarified. You can offer terms that benefit both parties, but those terms must always reflect the reality of your superior position. The moment you negotiate from false equality is the moment you begin your descent from wealth to poverty. Part 2, the execution of ruthless strategy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the bustling marketplace of Florence as Lorenzo and Machiavelli continued their discourse, moving from the theoretical framework of wealth accumulation to its practical implementation. Around them, merchants, artisans, and traders engaged in the daily rituals of commerce, haggling over prices, examining goods, extending credit, and settling debts. Each transaction represented an opportunity to apply the principles they had been discussing. The final rule, Machiavelli declared as they observed a particularly aggressive negotiation between a silk merchant and a potential buyer, encompasses all the others: adapt faster than your environment changes, or become extinct. The savage wealthy understand that survival depends not on perfecting a single strategy, but on mastering the art of strategic transformation. Lorenzo watched as the silk merchant, initially offering his goods at a premium price, quickly adjusted his approach when he realized the buyer had alternative suppliers available. Within minutes, the merchant had shifted from selling luxury to offering volume discounts, from emphasizing quality to highlighting convenience, from individual negotiation to package deals. The transaction concluded successfully, but only because the merchant had recognized and responded to changing circumstances faster than his customer could exploit them. Notice how quickly he adapted his approach, Machiavelli pointed out. He didn't cling to his initial strategy when it proved ineffective. The savage wealthy possess the same flexibility, but they apply it systematically rather than reactively. This observation led them to examine how the 10 rules function not as isolated principles but as an integrated system of wealth accumulation. The successful application of any single rule depended on understanding how it connected to and reinforced the others. Consider, for instance, how information advantage, the first rule, enabled control rather than competition, the second rule. A merchant who learned of an impending shortage could purchase available inventory before his competitors realized the opportunity existed. But mere ownership of goods wasn't enough. The truly savage operator would then use leverage, the third rule, to finance additional purchases, create artificial scarcity, the fourth rule, by controlling supply, and deploy reputation, the fifth rule, to convince buyers that the high prices were justified by genuine market conditions. The key, Machiavelli explained as they witnessed this exact sequence play out among grain merchants responding to reports of crop failures in Sicily, is that each rule multiplies the effectiveness of the others. Information without leverage limits your ability to act on it. Leverage without control exposes you to competitive pressure. Control without adaptability makes you vulnerable to technological or political changes. Lorenzo had been observing a young merchant who seemed to embody these principles instinctively. The man had started the day by purchasing wool from shepherds outside the city walls, but, rather than immediately reselling it in the marketplace, he had approached the Guild of Wool Workers with an exclusive supply contract that guaranteed him premium pricing in exchange for consistent delivery. He then used the contract as collateral to secure additional financing from a Jewish moneylender, allowing him to purchase more wool and establish relationships with additional suppliers. Watch how he constructs layers of advantage, Machiavelli noted. Each transaction creates new opportunities for the next. He doesn't simply buy and sell, he builds systems that generate wealth independently of his direct involvement. This systematic approach distinguished the savage wealthy from those who merely achieved temporary prosperity. The difference lay not in the scale of initial success but in the sustainability and expansion of that success over time. Those who understood the interconnected nature of the 10 rules could compound their advantages indefinitely, while those who applied the rules sporadically or in isolation inevitably found their gains eroded by more systematic competitors. The application of the 6th rule, that allies are temporary but obligations are permanent, required particular sophistication in the Florentine context. The city's merchant families had intermarried and formed partnerships for generations, creating a complex web of relationships that could shift rapidly based on economic and political circumstances. The savage wealthy navigated this environment by structuring their obligations to provide ongoing advantage regardless of how relationships evolved. Machiavelli pointed to the example of Francesco d'Aini, the merchant of Prato whose business empire had spanned Europe in the previous century. d'Aini understood that partnerships should create mutual dependencies that survived individual transactions. When he established trading houses in Barcelona, London, and Bruges, he didn't simply hire local agents, he made them partners with equity stakes in the businesses they managed. This ensured their loyalty even when market conditions made cooperation challenging. But d'Aini had gone further, using his partnerships to create intelligence networks that served multiple purposes. His partners reported not only on local market conditions but on political developments, trade route security, and the activities of competitors. This information allowed him to anticipate changes and position himself advantageously before his rivals understood what was happening. The savage wealthy, Machiavelli observed, understand that information is not just valuable in itself, it's valuable because it enables superior decision-making. The merchant who knows about a war before it's officially declared can position himself to profit from its economic consequences. The banker who learns of a prince's financial troubles can either demand additional collateral or prepare to seize assets before other creditors realize the danger. This led them to examine the 7th rule more closely. Striking when enemies were weak required not just recognizing weakness but creating the conditions that would make weakness inevitable. The most sophisticated practitioners of wealth accumulation didn't wait for their competitors to stumble, they engineered the circumstances that would cause their competitors to stumble. Lorenzo recalled how his grandfather had dealt with the Puzzi Bank's challenge to Medici dominance. Rather than attacking the Puzzi directly, Cosimo had systematically undermined their key relationships. He had offered better terms to their major depositors, created alternative financing options for their borrowers, and gradually isolated them from the political networks that supported their operations. By the time the Puzzi recognized the threat, they lacked the resources to respond effectively. The savage wealthy, Machiavelli explained, understand that direct confrontation is often the least effective form of competition. It's more efficient to manipulate the environment in which your competitors operate, forcing them to make decisions that serve your interests rather than their own. This environmental manipulation extended beyond individual competitors to entire market structures. The truly savage wealthy didn't just succeed within existing systems, they altered those systems to ensure their continued dominance. They influenced guild regulations, trade agreements, and legal frameworks to create barriers that prevented others from replicating their success. The 8th rule, that information travels through networks of trust, but trust is always conditional, required constant vigilance and sophisticated management. The same relationships that provided valuable intelligence could also expose sensitive information to competitors. The savage wealthy dealt with this challenge by compartmentalizing information, ensuring that no single individual or group possessed enough knowledge to threaten their operations. A successful merchant, Machiavelli noted, might have separate agents handling procurement, sales, and financing, with none fully understanding the other's activities. He might conduct sensitive negotiations through intermediaries who don't realize the full scope of the transaction. He might even create false information to test the reliability of his intelligence sources. But this compartmentalization had to be balanced against the need for coordination and efficiency. Too much secrecy could paralyze decision-making, while too much transparency could invite betrayal. The savage wealthy mastered the art of selective disclosure, providing each member of their network with exactly the information needed to perform their function effectively, but never more. The ninth rule, never retreat from a position of strength, often proves psychologically challenging for those unaccustomed to wielding power. Natural human instincts toward reciprocity and fairness could undermine strategic advantages if allowed to influence business decisions. The savage wealthy learned to suppress these instincts when they interfered with wealth accumulation. Compassion, Machiavelli observed, is a luxury that the poor cannot afford to indulge and the wealthy cannot afford to display. The merchant who reduces his prices out of sympathy for struggling customers will soon find himself struggling alongside them. The banker who forgives debts out of friendship will discover that friendship is not reciprocal when he needs support. Yet this didn't mean the savage wealthy were incapable of generosity or kindness, rather, they calculated these impulses as carefully as any other business decision. Public charity could enhance reputation and create political goodwill. Private kindness could secure loyalty and information. But these actions were strategic choices, not emotional responses. The morning had progressed into afternoon as Lorenzo and Machiavelli continued their observations and analysis. Around them, the marketplace had evolved through its daily cycles: early morning agricultural sales giving way to manufactured goods, local transactions expanding to include international traders, individual haggling escalating to guild-level negotiations. Each phase of this cycle provided opportunities for those who understood its rhythms and could position themselves accordingly. Part 3, The Savage Transformation. As evening shadows lengthened across the Arno River, Lorenzo and Machiavelli retreated to the biblioteca of the Palazzo Medici, surrounded by manuscripts and ledgers that documented centuries of commercial wisdom and political maneuvering. Their day of observation had transformed theoretical principles into practical understanding, but questions remained about implementation and consequences. These rules you've articulated, Lorenzo began, settling into his chair with a goblet of wine, seem to require a fundamental transformation of character. Can ordinary merchants truly adopt such savage approaches, or are they limited to those born with particular temperaments? Machiavelli considered this question carefully, recognizing its importance for understanding how wealth concentration occurred in practice. The transformation from ordinary merchant to savage accumulator is possible for anyone willing to pay its price, but that price extends far beyond monetary investment. It requires the systematic suppression of natural human impulses that interfere with strategic thinking. He gestured toward the ledgers that surrounded them, each representing years of calculated transactions and strategic positioning. Your family's rise to dominance wasn't achieved through superior intelligence or favorable circumstances alone. It required the willingness to make decisions that prioritized long-term advantage over immediate comfort, strategic positioning over personal relationships, and systematic accumulation over emotional satisfaction. This transformation typically occurred through 3 distinct phases, each presenting its own challenges and opportunities. The first phase involved recognizing that conventional moral frameworks were obstacles to wealth accumulation. Most individuals were raised to value fairness, reciprocity, and cooperation, virtues that served social stability but hindered competitive advantage. The savage wealthy learned to compartmentalize these values, applying them selectively based on strategic considerations rather than emotional impulses. Consider how you negotiate with a supplier who has become a friend over years of dealing, Machiavelli illustrated. The ordinary merchant feels obligated to offer fair terms that benefit both parties equally. The savage wealthy offers terms that reflect the true balance of power in the relationship, regardless of personal affection. If the supplier accepts disadvantageous terms because he trusts your friendship, you have successfully separated business advantage from personal sentiment. The second phase involved developing systematic approaches to information gathering, relationship management, and strategic planning. Natural human behavior tends toward reactive decision-making, responding to immediate circumstances without considering longer-term implications. The savage wealthy trained themselves to think in terms of sequences and systems, where each action was designed to create future opportunities rather than merely solve present problems. Lorenzo had witnessed this systematic thinking in his own family's approach to banking relationships. Rather than simply lending money to borrowers who could pay competitive interest rates, the Medici structured loans to create ongoing dependencies. They offered favorable terms to merchants who agreed to conduct all their banking exclusively with Medici institutions. They provided emergency financing to nobles who pledged political support. They created investment partnerships that gave them influence over their partners' strategic decisions. Each transaction, Lorenzo observed, becomes part of a larger pattern designed to accumulate power and influence rather than merely generate profit. Exactly, Machiavelli confirmed. The savage wealthy understand that immediate profit is often less valuable than future positioning. They willingly accept reduced returns on individual transactions if those transactions create strategic advantages that will generate superior returns over time. The third phase represented the most challenging transformation, learning to view other people as strategic assets rather than human beings deserving of consideration for their own sake. This didn't require cruelty or sadism, but it did require emotional detachment that allowed strategic calculations to override empathetic responses. The successful accumulator, Machiavelli explained, learns to evaluate every relationship through the lens of strategic utility. What information can this person provide? What resources do they control? What influence do they possess? How can their needs and desires be channeled to serve your objectives? These questions must be answered before you consider whether you like them personally or feel sympathy for their circumstances. This transformation often proved irreversible once completed. Individuals who successfully adopted savage wealth accumulation strategies found it difficult to return to conventional moral frameworks even in personal relationships. The systematic suppression of empathetic responses became habitual, affecting all interactions regardless of context. Lorenzo recognized this pattern in his own development. His early training in commerce and politics had gradually eroded his capacity for unconditional trust or disinterested generosity. He found himself calculating the strategic implications of every gesture of kindness, every offer of assistance, every expression of friendship. The habits of mind that enabled savage wealth accumulation had become his default mode of thinking. Is this transformation inevitable? He asked. Can one apply these principles selectively while maintaining the capacity for genuine human connection? Machiavelli considered this question seriously, drawing on his observations of successful merchants and political leaders throughout Italy. Some individuals managed to compartmentalize their savage behavior to specific contexts, treating business relationships strategically while maintaining authentic personal relationships. But such compartmentalization requires extraordinary discipline and self-awareness. More commonly, the strategic mindset gradually encompasses all aspects of life. This expansion occurred because the skills that enabled savage wealth accumulation, systematic evaluation of relationships, emotional detachment, strategic thinking, provided advantages in all social contexts, not just commercial ones. Family relationships, friendships, and romantic partnerships all offered opportunities for strategic positioning, and those accustomed to thinking strategically found it difficult to suppress this tendency even when it wasn't appropriate. The consequences of this transformation extended beyond individual psychology to affect entire social structures. As more individuals adopted savage wealth accumulation strategies, the social fabric that depended on trust, cooperation, and mutual consideration began to deteriorate. Markets became more ruthlessly competitive, political relationships more transactional, and social hierarchies more rigidly stratified. Yet paradoxically, this deterioration often accelerated the concentration of wealth rather than hindering it. As social bonds weakened and trust became scarcer, those who possessed superior strategic skills found it easier to exploit the confusion and uncertainty that resulted. The savage wealthy thrived in environments where conventional moral frameworks had broken down, because they were already adapted to operate without depending on trust or cooperation. We are witnessing, Machiavelli observed, a transformation not just of individual merchants but of commerce itself. The principles we've discussed are becoming standard practice rather than exceptional strategies. This means that those who refuse to adopt savage approaches will find themselves increasingly disadvantaged, while those who embrace them most completely will achieve dominance. This trend raised profound questions about the sustainability of social and economic systems based on savage wealth accumulation. Could societies function effectively when trust became a strategic liability rather than a social asset?
Could political institutions maintain legitimacy when governed by leaders who viewed citizens as resources to be exploited rather than people to be served? Could economic prosperity continue when the majority of participants approached transactions as zero-sum competitions rather than opportunities for mutual benefit? Lorenzo recognized these concerns from his own observations of Florentine politics.
As merchant families had grown more sophisticated in their strategic thinking, the city's governance had become more complex and unstable. Traditional alliances based on family ties and shared interests had given way to constantly shifting partnerships based on immediate advantage. Political decisions increasingly reflected the narrow interests of dominant merchants rather than broader community needs. The savage wealthy, he noted, may achieve individual success by undermining the social foundations that enabled their success in the first place. They prosper by exploiting trust and cooperation while systematically destroying the conditions that make trust and cooperation possible. Machiavelli nodded in recognition of this paradox.
This is why the 10th rule, adapt faster than your environment changes, becomes crucial for long-term survival.
The savage wealthy must not only respond to changing market conditions but also anticipate and prepare for the social consequences of their own strategies. Those who failed to consider these broader implications often found their wealth concentrated but vulnerable. They could dominate markets and accumulate vast resources, but they operated in increasingly hostile environments where every relationship was potentially dangerous and every transaction carried the risk of betrayal. Their success created the conditions for their own potential downfall.
The most sophisticated practitioners of savage wealth accumulation understood this dynamic and adapted accordingly.
They invested some of their resources in maintaining social stability, supporting institutions that protected property rights and enforced contracts. They cultivated reputations for reliability and fairness even while engaging in strategic manipulation. They created networks of mutual dependence that made their destruction costly for their competitors. The ultimate expression of savage wealth accumulation, Machiavelli concluded, is not the destruction of social order but its reconstruction according to principles that ensure your continued dominance. The most successful practitioners don't simply exploit existing systems, they create new systems that serve their interests while appearing to serve broader social needs. As night fell over Florence and the sounds of commerce gave way to the quieter activities of evening, Lorenzo and Machiavelli reflected on the implications of their discussion. They had articulated 10 rules that could transform ambitious individuals into savage accumulators of wealth, but they had also identified the social and psychological costs of such transformation. The choice faced by every merchant, banker, and trader was ultimately between accepting poverty and embracing savagery. Those who refused to adopt strategic approaches to wealth accumulation would find themselves increasingly marginalized in a world where such approaches were becoming standard practice. Those who embraced them would achieve material success but at the cost of their humanity and the social bonds that made life meaningful. Yet this choice was rarely made consciously or all at once. Most individuals drifted gradually towards savage approaches through a series of small compromises, each seemingly justified by immediate circumstances. They told themselves they were being practical rather than cruel, strategic rather than selfish, realistic rather than ruthless. By the time they recognized the extent of their transformation, they had already committed themselves to a path from which retreat was extremely difficult. Perhaps, Lorenzo mused, the most important rule is one we haven't explicitly stated: understand the price of what you're choosing before you choose it. The savage wealthy achieve their goals, but they must live with the consequences of achieving them. Machiavelli agreed, recognizing that their discussion had illuminated not just the mechanics of wealth accumulation but also its moral and social implications. The rules we've identified are tools, he concluded. Like any tools, they can be used skillfully or clumsily, for constructive or destructive purposes. The choice of how to use them and whether to use them at all remains with each individual who seeks to escape poverty and achieve prosperity. The 10 rules stood complete: information is currency, control over competition, leverage of other people's money, manipulation of scarcity and abundance, strategic use of reputation, permanent obligations over temporary allies, striking when enemies are weak, managing trust networks, never retreating from strength, and adapting faster than change. Together, they formed a comprehensive system for transforming ordinary merchants into savage accumulators of wealth. But they also represented a fundamental choice about the kind of person one wished to become and the kind of society one wished to create. The path to wealth was clear, but it demanded the sacrifice of everything that made the journey worthwhile except the destination itself. Whether that sacrifice was justified remained a question each individual would have to answer for themselves. In the flickering candlelight of the Palazzo Biblioteca, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom and wealth of centuries, Lorenzo and Machiavelli had mapped the territory between poverty and prosperity. The choice of which path to follow, and what price to pay for the journey, lay with those bold enough to venture into that savage landscape where only the most ruthless survived to tell their tales.